What if the greatest threat facing modern society is not something you can see? Not a war, not a recession, not a political movement. What if it is something far quieter than that? Something that never announces itself, never forces its way through the front door, and never appears in the form people expect. Because according to a growing number of exorcists, priests, and religious observers, that is exactly what is happening. They believe the battle is already underway. They believe it is spreading through homes, through families, through screens, through habits, and through minds. And most unsettling of all, they believe millions of people are participating in it without realizing it. For decades, one veteran exorcist claims he has sat face to face with people whose lives appeared to be collapsing under forces they could neither understand nor control. He has listened to stories that began ordinarily enough: a struggling marriage, a teenager withdrawing from family, a successful professional suddenly overwhelmed by despair. At first glance, none of these stories seemed unusual. Yet, according to him, a pattern began emerging. And the more he paid attention, the harder it became to ignore. Because what he was seeing was not isolated suffering. It was something larger, something systematic, something that appeared to be accelerating. But before we go any further, understand this. The warning he gives is not the warning most people expect. Popular culture has trained us to imagine evil in dramatic terms. We think of horror movies. We think of possessed individuals levitating off beds. We think of strange voices, dark rituals, and terrifying supernatural encounters. Those images are powerful because they are visible. They are shocking. They are impossible to ignore. But that, he argues, is precisely why they can be misleading. Because if darkness only appeared in those forms, most people would recognize it immediately. The real danger, he says, is what arrives disguised as something ordinary. A small compromise, a harmless distraction, a habit that seems insignificant, a voice that whispers. This doesn't really matter. And that is where the story becomes unsettling. Because, according to his experience, the most dangerous spiritual battles rarely begin with dramatic events. They begin with gradual surrender. Not all at once. One step at a time, one decision at a time, one compromise at a time, until eventually a person wakes up and realizes they have drifted much farther than they ever intended. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if the greatest victories are not won through force? What if they are won through fatigue? Think about the modern world for a moment. Never in human history have people been more connected, yet loneliness continues to rise. Never in human history have people had access to more entertainment. Yet boredom seems everywhere. Never in human history have people possessed more information. Yet confusion often feels overwhelming. At first, these trends appear unrelated. Different problems requiring different solutions. But according to this exorcist, they may share a common thread, because beneath the noise, beneath the headlines, beneath the endless stream of distractions, something essential may be disappearing. And few people are talking about it. The ability to be still, the ability to be silent, the ability to hear anything deeper than the next notification. Now, that may sound insignificant at first. After all, silence hardly feels like a matter of life and death. But that is where his argument takes an unexpected turn. Throughout history, nearly every major spiritual tradition has emphasized solitude, contemplation, reflection, and silence. Not because silence is comfortable, not because silence is pleasant, but because silence creates space. Space for examination, space for truth, space for conscience, space for God. And if that space disappears, something else inevitably takes its place. The question is what? This is where his concern becomes much more urgent. Because he believes modern culture has become extraordinarily effective at eliminating silence. Every spare moment can now be filled instantly, standing in line, waiting at a traffic light, eating lunch, lying in bed. The moment discomfort appears, distraction arrives. The moment silence appears, noise rushes in. The moment reflection begins, another screen lights up. At first, none of this seems dangerous. In fact, it feels normal. But according to his warning, normality itself may be the problem, because when distraction becomes constant, something unexpected begins happening. People stop examining their lives. They stop asking difficult questions. They stop confronting uncomfortable truths. And eventually, they lose the ability to distinguish between what they chose and what simply happened to them. That is not a dramatic collapse. It is a slow erosion. And slow erosion is difficult to notice while it is happening. Imagine a massive stone cliff facing the ocean. A single wave changes nothing. 1,000 waves change little. Even 10,000 waves seem insignificant. But over enough time, the entire landscape transforms. And by the time people notice, the damage is already extensive. According to this exorcist, that is exactly how darkness prefers to operate. Not through sudden conquest, through gradual normalization. Because normalization bypasses resistance. People fight obvious threats. They rarely fight familiar ones. And that brings us to a shift he claims has become impossible to ignore. When he first entered the ministry of exorcism, the cases that demanded serious intervention often followed recognizable patterns. There might be involvement with occult practices. There might be destructive addictions. There might be deliberate engagement with spiritual beliefs or rituals considered dangerous by the church. The pathways were visible. The warning signs were visible. The connections was visible. But over time, he says, something changed. More and more people began arriving with no obvious connection to those traditional pathways. No rituals, no occult involvement, no deliberate invitation. Yet many described remarkably similar experiences, an inability to feel peace, an overwhelming sense of emptiness, persistent despair. A strange resistance toward prayer or spiritual practices they once valued, a growing conviction that nothing truly mattered. And while these experiences can have many causes, including psychological and emotional ones, he became convinced that something deeper was happening, in at least some of the cases crossing his path. That conviction led him to ask a difficult question. What changed? His answer begins with culture itself. For generations, religious practices were woven into daily life, not necessarily because everyone was deeply devout, but because reminders of the sacred existed everywhere. A prayer before meals, a blessing before bed, a crucifix on the wall, a shared understanding that some things were holy. Some things mattered. Some things stood above ordinary life. Whether a person believed fully or not, those reminders shaped the environment. And environments matter. Anyone who has entered an old cathedral understands this instinctively. The moment you walk inside, something changes. Voice lower, movement slow, attention shifts. The space itself encourages a different state of mind. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine an environment where every symbol of transcendence is removed. No reminders, no rituals, no sacred rhythms, no shared practices, no silence. What fills the vacuum? That is the question he believes society has failed to ask. Because vacuums never remain empty. They are always filled by something. And according to his warning, modern culture has become extremely effective at replacing the sacred without acknowledging what has been lost. But culture is only part of the story. Because the next shift he identifies strikes even closer to home. It begins inside the family, specifically with a role he believes has quietly eroded over generations. The role of spiritual leadership. Now this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because discussions about fathers often trigger strong reactions. Yet the pattern he describes appears repeatedly in his experiences. Not perfect families, not flawless fathers, simply fathers who stopped engaging spiritually. Men who remained physically present, but gradually withdrew from spiritual responsibility. Men who provided financially, but never prayed. Men who protected materially, but never led morally. Men who occupied the home without shaping its soul. And according to his observations, that absence created consequences that often appeared years later. Because children learn what matters by watching what adults prioritize, not by listening to lectures. Not by hearing instructions, by observing behavior. If faith is treated as optional, children notice. If prayer is treated as unnecessary, children notice. If spiritual life occupies the margins, children notice. Eventually, those observations become assumptions, and those assumptions become beliefs. Then something remarkable happens. The next generation inherits not a rejection of faith. They inherit indifference. And indifference is often far more difficult to overcome. Because rejection at least requires engagement. Indifference requires nothing at all. But even that, he argues, is not the deepest challenge facing families today. Because another force has entered the picture, one more powerful than any previous generation could have imagined. A force that lives in nearly every pocket, sits beside every bed, travels everywhere, and demands attention every waking hour. Technology. Now, before you assume you know where this argument is going, stay with me. His concern is not that technology exists. His concern is what technology is doing to human attention. Because attention, he argues, is far more important than most people realize. Whatever captures attention eventually shapes identity. Whatever shapes identity eventually shapes decisions. And whatever shapes decisions eventually shapes destiny. That chain may sound dramatic. But consider how much of modern life is built around controlling attention. Entire industries compete for it. Algorithms optimize for it. Bratmos monetize it. And every second spent looking in one direction is a second not spent looking elsewhere. The implications of that become startling when viewed through a spiritual lens. Because what happens when a culture loses the ability to focus? What happens when contemplation becomes impossible? What happens when reflection feels unbearable? What happens when silence itself begins to feel threatening? According to The Exorcist, those are not technological questions. They are spiritual ones. And the consequences may be far greater than most people realize. Because once attention is fragmented long enough, something begins happening to the human will itself. And that is where the real battle begins. Not in haunted houses, not in horror movies, not in dramatic supernatural spectacles, but in the quiet struggle over who controls the direction of a person's life. And according to the warning that has emerged from decades of experience, that struggle is reaching a critical point. Because the next thing he discovered was even more disturbing than the spread of distraction. He discovered what distraction was making possible. And once he recognized the pattern, he could no longer unsee it. Once you start seeing life through the lens he describes, nothing looks neutral anymore. Not because the world suddenly becomes supernatural in a theatrical sense, but because the small patterns begin to connect into something larger, something harder to dismiss as coincidence. He claims that what comes next is the part most people resist hearing, because it moves from observation into responsibility, from analysis into choice, from noticing the problem into deciding what to do about it, because according to him, distraction was never the end goal. It was only the doorway. The real target was something deeper, the human will, not in the dramatic sense people imagine, not as a single moment of surrender, but as a gradual weakening through repetition, through fatigue, through the slow accumulation of small compromises that never feel significant in isolation. He describes it like this: the will is not overpowered, it is worn down, not conquered in a battle, but drained in a process that feels almost invisible while it is happening. And that is why, he argues, so many people feel strangely unable to change even when they know they should. They recognize patterns in their lives. They recognize habits they want to break. They recognize cycles that keep repeating. But recognition alone is not enough to stop momentum that has been building for years. So the question becomes uncomfortable. If awareness is not enough, then what is? He insists the answer has always been the same, but it has become unfamiliar in a world that prioritizes feeling over discipline and impulse over formation. The answer is formation of the will through repeated action, especially action taken when it is difficult, inconvenient, or emotionally unmotivated. And this is where his warning sharpens again, because he believes modern life is actively working against that formation. Not intentionally, in a simplistic sense, but structurally. Everything is designed to reduce friction. Everything is designed to remove delay. Everything is designed to eliminate discomfort. But a will that is never strengthened through resistance, he argues, becomes increasingly fragile when real resistance appears. And real resistance, in his view, always appears eventually, sometimes in the form of suffering, sometimes in the form of loss, sometimes in the form of temptation that cannot be ignored, sometimes in the form of crisis that forces a person to confront who they actually are when distractions are stripped away. He says this is where many people experience what they interpret as sudden collapse. But in reality, it is often not sudden at all. It is the moment when underlying weakness becomes visible. And that leads into Puzzle, one of the most controversial parts of his message. Because he claims that many of the struggles people interpret purely as psychological, emotional, or environmental may also have a spiritual dimension that is being overlooked, not replacing those explanations, but existing alongside them in a way that complicates simple conclusions. He is careful here because he knows how easily this can be misunderstood. He is not dismissing mental health. He is not denying trauma. He is not rejecting medical or psychological frameworks. Instead, he is insisting that human suffering may be multi-layered and that reducing everything to a single category can sometimes leave important dimensions unexamined. And when those dimensions are unexamined, he believes people can remain stuck in cycles that never fully resolve. But what makes this more urgent is what he claims about how those cycles feel from the inside. He describes them not as dramatic battles, but as exhaustion, a quiet draining of motivation, a sense of heaviness that makes even simple acts of goodness feel disproportionately difficult, a gradual shrinking of the interior world until life becomes reactive rather than intentional. And once a person reaches that state, he argues, they become far more vulnerable to patterns of thought and behavior they would have previously resisted, not because they suddenly become different people, but because their capacity to resist has been weakened over time. And that is the core idea he keeps returning to. Awakening precedes surrender. But even that, he says, is not the final stage, because there is another layer that emerges when resistance fades for long enough. A shift in perception itself. A person no longer simply struggles with habits or choices. They begin to reinterpret their struggle as identity. They stop saying, I am trying and failing, and start saying, this is just who I am. And once that shift happens, the possibility of change feels further away, even when it is still present. This is where he believes despair begins to take root. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind people imagine in extreme moments, but a quiet version. A slow acceptance that things will not improve. A subtle withdrawal from effort. A reduction of expectation. A narrowing of hope until it no longer stretches beyond survival. And in that space, he argues, something very dangerous happens because a person who no longer expects change stops looking for it. And a person who stops looking for change stops recognizing opportunities for it. At this point in his narrative, he shifts from diagnosis to warning again, but the tone is different. Now, it is less about what is happening in the world and more about what is happening inside the listener. Because the entire framework he is building leads to a single uncomfortable implication. If the problem is internal as much as external, then it cannot be solved by awareness alone. It requires action, not abstract action, not symbolic action, but consistent, disciplined, repeated action that goes against the inertia of habit and environment. He emphasizes this because he believes inertia is one of the most underestimated forces in human life. People imagine freedom as the absence of constraints, but he suggests something more unsettling. Freedom may actually require structure, repetition, and resistance to impulse. And that idea runs directly against the instincts of modern culture. So the conflict becomes clear. A culture that removes friction versus a life that requires friction to grow. A culture that rewards distraction versus a mind that requires focus to remain intact. A culture that encourages constant input versus a soul that requires silence to recover depth. And in that tension, he believes the real struggle unfolds. Not in dramatic moments, but in daily decisions that seem small but accumulate into direction. He then returns to the family, because in his view, this is where the battle becomes most tangible, not as abstraction, but as lived reality. He describes homes where connection has been replaced by parallel isolation. People sharing space, but not attention. Physically together, but mentally elsewhere. Each person absorbed in their own stream of input, their own cycle of distraction, their own private world of content and consumption. And over time, he argues, that fragmentation reshapes relationships in subtle but profound ways. Because intimacy requires presence, and presence requires attention. And attention, once divided long enough, becomes difficult to reclaim. This is where he becomes most urgent again, because he believes that what is at stake is not just individual well-being, but the stability of the family as a unit of formation. He sees the family not merely as a social structure, but as the primary environment where identity is shaped, values are transmitted, and interior life is formed. And when that environment becomes unstable, everything built upon it becomes unstable as well. But even here, he insists there is still a point of intervention. He does not frame it as dramatic reversal or instant transformation. He frames it as return. A return to practices that rebuild attention, restore order, and reintroduce meaning into spaces that have become noisy and fragmented, small actions repeated consistently that begin to change the internal rhythm of a home. Moments of silence that are protected rather than avoided. Shared time that is intentional rather than incidental. Practices that interrupt the automatic flow of distraction long enough for something deeper to reemerge. He does not claim this is easy. In fact, he emphasizes the opposite. He suggests it will feel unnatural at first, even uncomfortable, because any system built on constant stimulation resists removal of stimulation. But he insists that discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that something is being interrupted, and interruption, in his view, is where change begins. At this point, his message moves toward its final horizon, not as a conclusion of information, but as a conclusion of responsibility. Because everything he has described leads to a single, unavoidable question. If what he is saying is even partially true, then what kind of response is appropriate? He does not answer with panic. He does not answer with withdrawal. He does not answer with fear. He answers with decision. A decision about attention. A decision about habits. A decision about what is allowed to shape the inner life. A decision about whether life will be lived reactively or intentionally. And he frames that decision as something that cannot be postponed indefinitely, because postponement itself becomes a choice in favor of inertia, a choice in favor of drift, a choice in favor of whatever direction requires no resistance at all. And so he ends where he began, not with spectacle, but with a warning that has slowly transformed into a question directed at the viewer. What are you allowing to shape your attention when you are not paying attention to what is shaping it? And once that question is asked, he suggests it does not really leave. It continues quietly in the background, waiting for an answer that can only be given through action, not thought. And what comes next, he implies, depends entirely on whether that answer ever arrives at all.